There we go. Okay. All right. So here we are. So I
And
think
that's the whole panel. Congratulations,
okay, that's
everybody.
Good night. Okay. So, all right, here we are. So most of you know me. I'm Jody Hirsch. I'm the Director of Judaic Education at the Jewish Community Center. I have been here 22 years. Who knew? Who knew? I moved here from Hong Kong 22 years ago. You also see Dr. Amy Shapiro. Dr. Shapiro is a professor of philosophy. She retired recently from Alverno College, so she now is Professor Emerita. That's her official title. And she taught at Alverno for 33 years. And of course, we have Rabbi Joel Alter, who's the rabbi of
Congregation Beth Israel Ner
Tamid. And I see Mickey has just joined us. So I'm looking for my visual aids here. Okay, so Mickey, click on stop video. At the lower left-hand corner of your thing, hover over it, and then click on stop video. Okay. So just a little introduction. So I think most of you know most of us, that we're all in positions of various leadership in the Jewish community. Now, Amy is taught at Alverno College. That's not a particularly Jewish job necessarily, but you know, in her field in philosophy, she has become one of our local experts on Holocaust and genocide. And because of that, she's been incredibly involved in the Jewish community. And at one time, she was the director of HERC, actually. And so she's been very generous with her time. We've exploited her often to do talkbacks at movies or to speak on various things. And Rabbi Alter, of course, is fairly. How long have you been here now?
Not quite 2 years.
Not quite 2 years. So he's the new boy on the block. So we wanted to kind of explore the whole area of Jewish identity, of gay and lesbian identity, of, you know, being leaders in the Jewish community, and what that means. So I'd like to ask both of you, you know, do you think that being gay or lesbian, do you think that influences your sense of yourself as a Jew? Is that so? I think I'm going to ask Amy. I think I'm going to ask you to start.
Of course you are.
I can start if you want me to.
No, it's all right. I'll start. This was really, really hard to answer. And I realized that it was just like a totally complicated issue for me because, did you ask how being lesbian for me?
Yes, influences your sense of yourself as a Jew.
Because I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and so it's bound up as well with being female. And as I thought about this, I thought, you know, when I was growing up, the women's roles in Judaism, I was bat mitzvahed, but my older sister was not. There were no women rabbis. They had very traditional roles. My mother was not a traditional person. And as I thought about this, I thought about how complicated it's been for me in terms of identity to fit things together, and that there was this sort of, I don't know if it's a word, trifurcation between my identity as a Jew, my identity as a woman, and then my reflection on myself, becoming aware that I was a lesbian. And I should say here, and this will complicate things and we can talk about it later, that if the word queer as it's used today had been available then, I think I would have thought about it quite differently. So I think that my experience of myself as a lesbian, and I'm not sure even what that means, but my experience of myself as a lesbian actually had a rather negative effect on myself as a Jew, because I did not know how to fit myself into a Jewish community that challenged me in terms of female roles. And then also it got complicated because in the 50s and 60s growing up, it wasn't really safe to be a lesbian, and there were really no role models for me. Not really until the 70s. And I bring that up because this was something Jody talked a little bit about, and it made me think about what was really lacking. And one of the things I would say, sad to say, and I'm here, so it's significant, but when I was a teenager, I tried to kill myself twice. And looking back, I realized that it had a very solid connection to my identity, my sexual identity and my gender identity. And I did not know how to fit that into, I mean, it was complicated enough to fit it into my Jewish identity. I had no real way to think about that.
Yeah. So Rabbi Alter.
The short answer is yes. My being a gay man complicates or it both complicates and affects it. It influences my life as a Jew. I was first coming out to myself after I graduated college, as I was I want to qualify everything, but let's just leave it there. After I graduated college, as I was moving toward enrolling in rabbinical school. And at the time, the conservative movement was in a different place than it is now. It would not knowingly ordain gays or lesbians as rabbis or cantors. And so really, I had the experience of coming out to myself in the closet. Coming out to myself in the closet vis-a-vis my my social setting, my academic setting, my professional path, and so on. And that was certainly complicated. And there were significant moments of doubt of whether I would be able to, whether there was whether there was a path for me as a Jew. But I want to emphasize that while there was a lot of confusion around that, I never, thank God, I never had the kind of crushing alienation that leads many an observant Jew who is gay or lesbian or bi or trans into deep depression, self-harm, or anything like that, or even abandoning Judaism. Abandoning Judaism was never a possibility for me, and because it would be cutting off my right arm. Right? It is so integral to who I am that I had to struggle with how to make that work. But a parting of the ways was never really on the table for me. As I've matured and matured at a time where acceptance and integration of gays and lesbians in Western society and also in Jewish life have grown, right? So that's been a nice coincidence. As I've matured, I would say that my being gay has helped anchor my confidence in the breadth of Judaism, in a non-literal understanding of Judaism. That the Torah needs to be taken very seriously, but it's a gross error to take the Torah literally. without awareness of its history, that it doesn't float above history, but in fact has a history that is vital to understanding its proper interpretation. So there's more to say, but that's the beginning of my answer.
Sure. And for me, I forgot to mention before that one interesting aspect of the fact that the three of us are here is that I was born in the 1940s. Professor Shapiro was born in the 1950s. And Rabbi Alter was born in the 1960s. So our experiences learning about ourselves and interacting with society are slightly different, actually. And of course, not to mention the fact that two of us are men and one is a woman, that also has a tremendous difference in the way. And so I think, in a way, if being gay enriched my life and my identity, it was because I found myself being in two minority groups, and two groups that often were hated. And I've always, I didn't really realize that I was gay until I was 15 or 16, but I've always looked at that as something that is a powerful thing in my life, is the potential of people hating me because who I was. And of course, when I was a teenager, I was very involved with my youth group. I was really involved with my synagogue. I actually wanted to be a rabbi. But who do I talk to about being gay? I couldn't be out. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell my parents till I was in my 30s. I didn't come out more publicly until I was in my 40s. And it was a secret. And I actually, at age 15, 16, I actually thought there was something wrong with me. You know, that I used to have this fantasy that I wished that I had a little pill that I could take that would make me normal. I even used that term normal. I mean, today, I don't know what normal means, but I don't really believe that being gay is abnormal. But when I was a kid, you know, I wished I could take that pill, but I couldn't. And I actually decided that I couldn't be a rabbi because there was something wrong with me, because potentially I hadn't acted on anything, but I had desires that were quote unquote sinful. And how could I be a rabbi that had sinful desires? So that had a huge, you know, influence on how I saw myself. But at the same time, I mean, I didn't learn to be proud, and I didn't learn to understand that being gay is a huge part of who I am, and what my personality is, and what my interests are, and what my commitment even to education. For me, not every gay or lesbian person goes into education, but I think for me it was, because I knew, being born in the 40s, I wasn't going to have a family. People of my generation generally had children only if they tried to be straight and get married, and then they had children, you know, and eventually a lot of us would get divorced. And so having a family just didn't seem possible, you know, and I'm looking at my two colleagues here, both of whom have children. And so I'm a little envious, I have to tell you, but that didn't very often happen to someone of my generation. But at the same time, I saw myself as I understood being in a minority in a very powerful way. So, you know, and my next question I wanted to ask really was, well, how does our being Jewish affect our understanding of being gay or lesbian? So I guess I'll start that one. But, you know, once I started really studying, I realized that there have been gay and lesbian Jews for as long as there have been Jews. And I suppose I have this kind of radical view of how I read text, how I read the Bible, how I read the Talmud, but it's possible to find role models, you know? And so I think that the fact that I was gay and I was part of this double whammy of two of two minority groups. I think in my case, that helped me create a kind of an empathy for people, and not just for other Jews, but for everybody, you know, whether different races, different manners of education. I mean, I really think that that's a big part of so my sense of being Jewish and always being engaged in that really had a big sense. I remember when I was in my 20s and I was starting my career, and I was sure that if anyone knew that I was gay, my career would be over. And you know what? It would have been over. And I kind of promised myself at age 22 or 23 that I was going to work at this career, and that I was going to excel, and that I was going to gain respect. And by the time I reached age 40, if I didn't have I would come out. And if I didn't have the respect of people that I had worked with, then I was going to have to find a different career. That's what was going through my mind. And just before my 40th birthday, I was asked to write an article for a book. It's actually the first book written ever about gay Jews. It's called Twice Blessed. And it came out just before my 40th. It was going to come out just before my 40th birthday. And I wrote a whole chapter in that book about looking for role models in Jewish history. And I really kind of struggled over whether I was going to use a pseudonym or I was going to use my own name. I decided, I said, you know what? You've been saying for 20 years that you're going to come out when you're 40. And so I'm going to use my own name. And I did. And that was it was a really huge step at age 40 to do that. And of course, once that happened, you know, everyone knew. I was working at the Bureau of Jewish Education in San Francisco at the time. Only one person and the people that all the professionals that I worked with, there was one person who was outraged and who said that he would never work with the Jewish community, with the Bureau of Jewish Education again. But I actually got, you know, a lot of support, and it was a very emotional thing for me to get that, because I didn't know what was going to happen. So anyway, so that connection of being Jewish and being gay, I think that both of them really influence how I see myself as a Jew and how I see myself as a gay. So who wants to go next? No one?
I'm happy to go, Amy.
Good, you go. You go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Trying to think how to enter into this comment. I think that I'm a guy who never really rebelled against my parents' values. In not in every respect, but there was never a you know, the stereotypical I have nothing to do with you, I reject everything you stand for. I never had that rebellion, and I think that a deep sense that I am part of Jewish tradition, part of the Jewish people, and that the Jewish path that I alluded to in my first comment ultimately would be available to me, right? For a long time, I couldn't figure out how. But then once I figured out that I was actually not different from anyone else, I was just I had been barking up the wrong tree until I figured out that I'm gay. That wasn't easy, but in the end, it was simple. And so that actually complicated, and in some respects continues to complicate my life as a gay man. And that is because my sense that that romance and sex are about are ultimately have an eye on marriage and family. That notion was so ingrained in me that that it complicated my participation in general gay culture, because it was hard to find gay Jews who had similar commitments to mine. And so it was a small pool. And of course, once I became a rabbi, and as I said, I was only coming out to myself as I began rabbinical school. So the absence of a gay adolescence was significant in my stepping into my gay identity and participation in general gay culture. But again, more to say on that. But I've pointed to that, and then I also want to say that the comment that you, Jody, made about empathy. Empathy and an embrace of the diversity of human experience, the diversity of sexual experience in a really positive way, is something that I think is a product, is consonant with my Jewish identity. I think that sadly, so many people just, it's axiomatic for them. Oh, yeah, homosexuality, gay, lesbian, of course that's a violation of religion, and so the two can't live together. And that never, or again, once I matured a little, that made no sense to me. That sex is a wonderful thing, and people are diverse, and human experience is diverse, and we're all created by the same God, and that somewhere between that self-hatred, or alternatively this commitment to being counter, that, oh, if I'm gay, I must be counter religious norms and conventional norms. Not so. that a gay spirit is a wonderful and holy spirit too.
Beautiful.
My turn.
Your turn.
So I had to think about the trajectory of my life and my experience of myself as a Jew, because I'm not actively involved in Jewish things. Interestingly enough, as I moved across the country, as I came to the Midwest, first to Chicago for grad school and then to Milwaukee to teach, I was confronted with my difference as a Jew from others. I had grown up in I'd grown up in an environment where there was a lot of prejudice, but Jewish life in my family was central. So and then I went to a college that was 60% Jewish, and it was near New York City. So when I came to the Midwest, I was kind of confused, basically, about what I took as sort of a natural part of my world, and realized that the values that I carried were distinctly Jewish. And I think that I began to realize that my engagement with philosophy had its roots in Judaism, in the practices of exploration, explication of text. The things that I love doing in philosophy are things that Jews do on a regular basis. And I began to see that, especially when I started teaching at Alverno, because Alverno is a Catholic women's college, and really I was one of 2 Jewish faculty, which just seemed very strange to me. And I began to realize that I held I held values in a different kind of way, and that the root of my interest and the root of my interest in Holocaust, most people think it's because I'm a Jew. Maybe indirectly it is, but it's really mostly from my attempt to try and make sense of the ways in which the event of the Holocaust, the fact of the Holocaust, has influenced the way in which we understand what it is to be human. And what much like what both Jody and Joel said, is I'm very influenced, I think, by the experience of being an outsider as a lesbian who has not really ever, I've come out, but in a way I kind of left it alone, but also as an outsider, as a Jew. And what I started to think about was how my resistance to being out is very much tied to the desire not to be seen in terms of the stereotypes that are attached to the label. And I think that the source of that is both being a Jew and being a lesbian, that it was more effective for me to come out as a Jew in my classroom and safer than it was to come out as a lesbian. So I didn't. But I came out as a Jew in a way that I never thought I would need to. And I think in many ways, this relationship and this sort of bifurcation at this point has been a source of my own pedagogy. I am very, very sensitive to the ways in which stereotypes are used to define people. And when Crenshaw, who theorized about the notion of intersectionality, the idea of multiple identities and the complexity of the interface between, say, race and ethnicity and sexual identity and gender identity and all of these things that really echoed profoundly with me. And I think that the consequence has been that I became a really good teacher and became very engaged with the idea, with the philosophy of teaching, because I recognized the complexity of human identity. And I think that began with my my sense of myself as a Jew, and my sense of myself as a Jew in environments where there were a few Jews, and then then it was influenced by that, influenced my sense of myself as a lesbian. And I used to joke with I should also add, my long-term partners, I've had 2, were both non-Jewish. So I used to joke that my parents didn't care that my partners were female, but they didn't like the fact that they weren't Jewish. And it was significant. And as I've developed and I've been single for 10 years, I realize more and more that the intersection of my Jewish identity and my lesbian identity really longs for a connection that I haven't experienced.
Yeah, no, so the 3 of us then, we're professionals. I think I can't speak for both of you, but I think it'd be fair
You
to
will,
say
right?
that, yeah, I've tried to, but God knows. But I think it'd be fair to say that our sense of ourself as a gay or a lesbian in our profession probably has undergone some kind of a process. I'm the oldest, and as I said, I didn't come out till I was 40, and I had a really interesting experience. When I was in graduate school at UCLA in Hebrew literature, I taught at Los Angeles Hebrew High School, which was, it was a conservative movement Hebrew high school. I taught for many years. I have all these students. A lot of them, I'm still in touch with them. They want me to meet their children, when I'm in LA. It's a really great thing. And I realized for me that being a teacher is for me to create a family that I wasn't going to do biologically. I mean, that was something that was really, really important to me. And I had this one very odd but very brilliant student. and then when he graduated from high school, he went to UCLA. So I used to run into him on campus at UCLA. And we would have coffee. I mean, in those days, I would never have invited a student like out to dinner or for nothing, of course. But, having coffee on campus at UCLA was great. And then there was a moment, I just will never forget it. It was in June of that particular year. And I got a telephone call from this student at midnight. We'd never, ever talked on the phone. And, a little small talk, how are you doing? I haven't seen you on campus, and then he comes out to me. Mm. And it turns out I was very active in this organization called the Gay Academic Union, which was a very closeted thing. We had these secret meetings, and it was all professors and graduate students. And we would give papers that were kind of in our field, but with a sort of gay or lesbian, we didn't call ourselves queer in those days, but a gay or lesbian interest, something that most of us would never publish because it would ruin our career in those days. Mm-hmm. But it was a chance to show some of our scholarship. And there was a national gay academic union workshop in Los Angeles. The people came from all over the country to come to this. And so this student's name was Rick. He's gay, and his gay roommate was in my workshop. And so went home and just, they weren't boyfriends, they were just roommates, but went home and just raved about my workshop. And it was the first time that Rick ever realized that me, his favorite teacher, could have been gay. It just didn't even occur to him because he, like me, was very closety. And not only that, he's telling me all of this. He had a rabbi, was a conservative rabbi in the San Fernando Valley, who often sermonized about how horrible homosexuals were. And who just explicitly said that if you are a homosexual and you are Jewish, you can't be both at the same time. You have to choose one or the other. And so here's this poor kid, So I should add that the conference that enabled him to find out that I was gay was in December. It took him more than 6 months to work up the nerve to call me. And I was a Jewish role model of his. And he needed to talk to me. It took him 6 months. And so I realized that was a huge part of my evolution. I realized that just as I needed respectable gay, lesbian role models within the Jewish world that I could look to and say, you know what, they're really great. I'm okay. Just as I needed that, so did Rick. And so did who knows how many students that I had. And so I've always felt that, it's not something, this is very unusual, the situation right here. I don't always talk about what it means to me to be gay or whatever. But at the same time, I'm not ever hiding it. And I think it's important for people to know who I am. And And I need to know people to know that I'm available if they need to talk to me. And I think that that's part of who I see myself as a teacher. What about the other two of you, that being leaders? What part does being gay or lesbian have to do with your leadership, and whether or not you feel that it's important, not important, that people know?
Well, I think you've articulated, I mean, something for me that is deeply important, and that is my sense of responsibility to the world and what form that comes in. So I was never out to students. I didn't, for a variety of reasons, but students who needed me to be out to them would show up. If I mean, that we know that even if you hadn't done that workshop, that there are people who recognize things about us that, and that you know, it's called gaydar, radar, whatever. And I mean, I periodically would have students not know that they saw something in me that they reflected on in themselves, and they would come and be present, and they'd need a witness, and they'd also need a role model. And when that happened, I made myself available. And I think what's interesting to me from the Jewish standpoint is, because what drives me, I think, in everything I do is that sense of repair, the ongoing sense of tikkun olam that plays out. And but I have to say that in my work in the Jewish community, one of the reasons that I think I felt, I mean, there were a number of reasons where when I stepped down from running the Holocaust Center, it was mostly because I think it needed someone who could take it the next level. But I also found it incredibly challenging to be in two different landscapes. My home life that didn't quite fit into the Jewish community, as both a lesbian and someone whose partner was not Jewish, and running the Holocaust Center. And so I felt I needed to like not be cut in two, and that there were better ways that I could serve the community. And I mean, interestingly enough, you know, I'm not a religious Jew, but I love doing the things that I've been asked to do in the Jewish community. It's it's why I always say yes, even saying yes to this, even though this has made me very anxious and tense, and I'm not sure what I'm doing and whatever, because I've never talked about this publicly. But it is a link for me, and it also allows me to be a leader without maybe the trappings of all the things that come along with it. And you know, I'm a weirdo, so I don't quite fit anywhere. So at least I have this little blessing of the Jewish community inviting me to do talkbacks and conversations about Holocaust-related material.
Sure, Joel.
So I'll echo what both of you have said. In my adolescence, you know, my time at summer camp was very important to me, and I had critically formative years as a counselor and a division head at Camp Ramah, and then moved into classroom teaching, as well as the rabbinate, right? So my whole professional path is imbued with a priority of trying to be a role model, being conscious that, like it or not, people will see me as a role model, and I'd better be the best that I can be in that role. And so so certainly I've been very conscious to, wherever I have the opportunity, to normalize being gay and Jewish, just being gay, or being gay and Jewish, is very, is very important. And there have been times where I'm not so much a flag waver, although I do sometimes put out the flag, and I have to remember to put it out in front of my house. It is Pride Month after all. It's more of thank you. In a given moment, if mentioning that I'm gay or bringing up homosexuality, if it's in its right place in the conversation, go there. Don't avoid it. And that leads me to take a step back to say that, in a lot of my comments this evening, I've talked about more or less a sense of integration, or arriving ultimately at a sense of comfortable integration, frustrations notwithstanding. And I want to be clear that the experience of coming out in the closet in rabbinical school was a terrible experience.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible. And the experience of, it's a long story and you can read about it. There's a chapter telling about my experience as a closeted rabbinical student in a book called Passing, which I recommend that you read. It happened that in the years that I was in the seminary were precisely the years that the conservative movement took its first pass at considering the normalization of homosexuality in the Jewish community. That attempt failed spectacularly, but it was a critical first step. And when the movement came back again 10 years later, everything had changed. But during my 5 years there, it was the constant conversation. And publicly anyway, I could never participate in the conversation in my own voice.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a terrible experience. When I went to my 25th college reunion, it dawned on me that one of the reasons that I did not get into my college life so well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why I was not so attached to that place is that I didn't know who I was.
Mm-hmm.
I was not yet out to myself. I was beginning, but I was not yet out to myself. And so I have a clear conviction that for a gay or lesbian or bi or trans person to expend energy dissembling, masking, hiding, closeting is a tragic
Mm-hmm.
Sapping of their human energy and potential. And there are just huge moral implications to that, and that is unacceptable. And so in terms of leadership, I try to be conscious of that and not to allow anyone to shrivel in the closet, at least under my watch.
Jody, you're muted.
Gosh. So we have 10 minutes late, maybe only 8 minutes. And so if people would like to ask questions, so I invite you now to click to run video. Click on that little video thing so we can all see you, your punums. And I think there are only 24 cameras, so I can see everybody. So if anybody has a brief question that you would like to ask, raise your hand, a question, and you can either address it to one of the three of us or to all three of us if you'd like. Yes, Barbara. Wait a minute.
Barbara, unmute yourself.
I think I have to unmute you. Wait a minute. I'm going to unmute everybody, so don't make noise. Okay, go ahead.
She's still muted.
You're still, I think you're, no, you're not muted, but turn up your volume maybe.
No, she's muted.
It's muted.
No, she's not muted.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
yeah.
could see the,
Oh, you
We can see
can?
the little red
I'm
icon.
getting
Oh,
There we
okay,
go.
mine she's not.
now she isn't.
Okay,
Okay. So this question is for Rabbi Alter. I heard you say early that in the conservative movement, there was no way that you could pursue your journey at the time that you wanted to do it, because there was no path for you to be a rabbi at that time. And you did say that, didn't you?
Well, yes, but I did it anyway, but in the closet.
That was my question, but you did it anyway.
Right.
And not knowing what was going to happen, yes?
Well, if I could avoid coming out to the dean or faculty who might, pass word on to the dean for 5 years, then I would be ordained. And once ordained, there's no taking back ordination. You know, it's not like the Catholic defrocking of a priest. It's not like that. So that's what I needed to do, and that's what I did.
Okay, thank you.
George.
As a person born in the 30s,
Even older than me.
I am chronologically older than you, yes. I was subjected to physical acts because of violence because I am Jewish. Did any of the three of you suffer any type of physical actions, either because of your Jewish or because of your sexual orientation?
Good question.
I have to say, one of the things we talked about is, on the whole, lesbians are invisible. And I actually believe even today they're invisible. But I can tell you that in the 70s, when I would go with friends into New York City to go to lesbian bars, we were very aware of the risks. And we were always on the lookout because the potential for violence was always there. I think that was to a greater extent for gay men at that time. And as a Jew growing up, I grew up in the home of the John Birch Society, which then eventually came out here. So I grew up in a very, very prejudiced town, very anti-Semitic. And we would get called names and we would be excluded from participating in certain things, that they'd throw pennies at us at lunch. The sort of thing, you know, many people in the 50s and 60s experienced. So my sense of being Jewish and being I wouldn't say a victim, but certainly that there were people who wished to do harm and was always present in my years growing up. And you know, I'm 20 years younger than you are, George, so I don't know where, there you are. So you know, that's it's significant, I think, that it was still going on in the 60s and 70s. This was in the Boston area, and it was really very it was cruel. So I think the combination of both of those things, it was shocking to me to move to New York for college and be in a city that closed down for Rosh Hashanah and be around so many Jews at college.
I think I've never had any violence directed at me, but certainly both homophobia and anti-Semitism. Even high school teachers were kind of anti-Semitic and would make comments, and I was singled out, I think. When I moved to Houston, there's this one gay part of town in Houston, and there's a corner with 4 gay bars, one on each corner. And the week before I arrived in Houston, there was an incident in which a gay person going to one of those bars couldn't find parking near the bar, and had to park, you know, blocks away. And as he was walking to the bar, he was confronted by a pickup truck with these guys with 2x4s, and they beat him to death. This was a week before I arrived in Houston, and that was terrifying. These Texas rednecks, and I would go to those bars on occasion. I would drive, it was way across town. If I couldn't find a parking space within half a block from those bars, I just went home. It was terrifying. So yes, I mean, it's all around, and it's still around, both as a Jew and as a gay person. Yes?
Well, I just want to say that happened about 5 years ago in Milwaukee,
Right.
if you remember.
I do.
There was a man coming from, he was somewhere around one of the gay clubs down in the downtown, and he was confronted by some people and they killed him.
I mean, it still is there, and you
Yeah.
know, it's and that's part of that that intersection of Jewish and gay. Again, you know, I feel that threatened sometimes, especially now being Jewish. I mean, there's just so much stuff out there. So, but I've never had any violence directed against me. Maybe one more question. Yes, Andrea.
Thank you all for doing this tonight. And my question is, what is the current definition of queer?
Nobody really knows.
Nobody really knows.
Okay.
You know, it's really funny because, you know, in my day when I was young, that was nothing but a derogatory term.
Right.
But especially young people have chosen that to mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that we have a philosopher here, so maybe she can help us. But, you know, it just means, it can mean a lot of things. It could mean fluidity of gender. It could mean different aspects of sexuality. It just means being different, I think, in the matter of sexual or gender or, you know.
I think it's a way of taking back definition, because instead of being defined by who you have sex with, you define yourself in terms of your relationship to your own identity. And that's what it means to me, is that as someone who's queer, I do experience a kind of gender fluidity. My experience, I never wanted others defining me by the person I chose to be with, or the person I chose to sleep with. I wanted to be be self-determining in relationship to that. And, you know, I'm a woman in a highly masculine field that has required people to think in a particular kind of way. And I absolutely adore philosophy. And I feel as if philosophy is very much part of my identity as opposed to a discipline. Because of the way in which it showed me that the way I thought was not crazy. And so I think of myself as queer in part because it's a way of sort of articulating that my way of being and my relationship to the world it's self-determined, but it's also determined by the experience of being a lesbian in the world and living within the margins of community. So it is a broader term that also allows one to self-define.
When I lived in Los Angeles, Christopher Isherwood was still around, and he lived in Santa Monica Canyon. And he was an icon of the gay and lesbian community in those days. And I would see him often, and I never once had the nerve to go up to him and tell him I loved his work and blah, blah, blah. You know, I mean, his Berlin Stories is what the musical Cabaret is based on. So he actually said he purposely used the word queer and fag and other awful words. And he said he purposely used that word because he wanted to diffuse it of negative terms. And he felt that we queer people need to embrace that terminology and celebrate it rather than let it become a derogatory term. So I've thought of, this was years and years ago, but I've thought of that often. And so it's the young people really who have brought this sort of queer theory and queer pride. And I love that. I mean, I think that has become a really, in my eyes, an appropriate term. So thank you all for coming. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, Joel.
Can I just want to add one more voice in response to Andrew's question, if I may. I think that in an earlier time, you know, one might say of another person, well, you know, he, she is very idiosyncratic, they're a little different, a real individual, and somebody might say that about themselves. And I think that the individualism of queer identity is significant, but I think it's not the most important thing. I think that, Peter is writing transgressive many values beyond sexuality. I think that's helpful, Peter. I think that as I understand the term queer, it's making a statement about what it is to be human. Mm-hmm. That the boxes, the norms, the expectations that comfortably apply to many do not apply to all. And it is a way of saying that human experience, human desire, human gender, and I don't have my thoughts together enough to add, say it again?
Masculinity and femininity. Right. You know, there's all these things that we think of as binaries, but they're not.
Right. That there is far greater variety in human experience, and that those who would establish norms, you want to establish norms, but establish norms knowing that many people will not fit comfortably within them. And you have to allow for the dynamism that that difference creates. And Jewishly, we oughtn't have tonight's panel without mentioning the yeshiva founded in Chicago by my colleague and friend Rabbi B'nai Lappi, which calls itself a queer yeshiva. You know, a certain number of the people who teach and study there are gay or lesbian or trans or queer in some other fashion. A certain number of them are, but everyone who learns there is queer, right? And what they're saying is that describes a way of looking at the world, a way of looking at Judaism. They would say that Judaism is queer in the world and in human history. And so it's really about a dynamic difference and not merely about individualism.
Great. So thank you all for coming to this. This is, of course, our observance of Pride Month. And thank you to Amy and to Joel for your openness and for your insight and for your courage. I mean, I think this was a really remarkable experience, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Jody, for facilitating.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. So,
Thank you.
And Shabbat Shalom tomorrow.
Yeah.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much.